He was 19, openly gay, and he went after the government, on purpose. Not for attention, not for drama, but because queer kids were being erased and no one else was saying it. Joe Locke could have stayed quiet. He chose to fight. But before he stood up for millions, he had to find his voice in a place that barely let him whisper. Let me start with a question. Have you ever felt like you were just born in the wrong place? Not in a dramatic movie trailer kind of way. I mean in that quiet, aching kind of way, where everything around you feels too small for the dreams you haven't even dared to say out loud yet. That's exactly where Joe Locke's story begins. Not in Hollywood, not in some bustling theater district, but on a tiny, wind-swept island between England and Ireland called the Isle of Man. Now pause. How many of you just Googled that? No shame. It's okay. Most people outside the United Kingdom have never heard of it, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? Imagine growing up somewhere so small that your story already feels written before you hit your teens. Where tradition isn't just respected, it's expected. Where boys play sports, girls wear pastels, and queerness is something whispered if it's mentioned at all. Joe was born into that kind of place in 2003. He was quiet, observant, sharp, but soft-spoken. Not the kind of kid who demanded attention, but the kind who noticed everything. You know the type. Always watching, always wondering. Not quite fitting in, but never trying to force it either. That was Joe. From a young age, he knew he didn't move through the world the same way the other boys did. He didn't know the label for it. He just knew that his favorite place wasn't the football field. It was anywhere he could pretend to be someone else. Because for Joe, acting wasn't about escaping, it was about expanding, becoming, breathing. And if you're watching this and nodding right now, yeah, I see you. The drama kids, the theater nerds, the quiet rebels who found refuge in made-up characters because being yourself didn't feel safe yet. Joe was one of us. His first experiences with performance came through school plays, local productions, tiny stages with squeaky floorboards and mismatched costumes. But to him, they were everything. Each role, no matter how small, gave him space. Space to explore, to emote, to exist. And while other kids were dreaming of getting out of math class, Joe was dreaming bigger. He was memorizing lines, studying performances, watching YouTube interviews of actors, and wondering, could that ever be me? But here's the thing. In a place like the Isle of Man, ambition like that doesn't get applause. It gets side eyes, it gets, don't get ahead of yourself, it gets, you're dreaming too big for a place like this. And yet, Joe didn't back down. He just worked harder. By the time he was 15, he applied to the National Youth Theatre in London. That's a massive leap. Think about it. Most kids his age were still figuring out how to get through Monday. Joe was auditioning for one of the most competitive youth programs in the United Kingdom. And guess what? He got in. Let's stop there for a second. Because I want you to really let that sink in. A soft-spoken teenager from a tiny island who had never even seen the kind of stages he dreamed of, bet on himself. He sent in a tape, he packed his bags, and he went. Now, have you ever had a moment like that? Where everything in your world was telling you to stay small, to be quiet, to follow the rules, and you still took the leap anyway? If you have, you know how terrifying and beautiful that moment is. And if you haven't, maybe Joe's story is the reminder you needed that the leap is worth it. London was a culture shock in the best way. Here was a city full of people who walked fast, talked loud, dressed weird, and didn't care who was watching. For the first time in his life, Joe didn't feel other. He felt possible. He trained, he studied, he observed, and slowly, the boy who used to shrink himself started to expand. Not with arrogance, but with purpose. He began to imagine a life where he could be himself and be seen, where he didn't have to choose between being real and being successful, where his softness wasn't a weakness, but a superpower. He still had no connections, no fancy last name, no agent whispering promises, just that same quiet fire. And then one day, it happened. A casting call, open to the public, Netflix, a new series, something about two boys falling in love. No pressure, right? Joe filmed a self-tape in his bedroom. No ring light, no glam, just raw truth, unfiltered emotion. And that same dream he carried since he was a kid, with a borrowed script and a heart full of questions. And he hit send. He didn't know it yet, but that video was about to change everything. And just like that, everything changed. Joe didn't know it at the time. He was just a kid in a hoodie, sitting on his bedroom floor, sending in a self-tape like 1,000 others. He didn't have high hopes. Why would he? Netflix? Open casting? It sounded like a lottery. The kind meant for kids with perfect jawlines and famous last names. But someone, somewhere, watched his tape and didn't just see a character. They saw something real, not the polished kind of real. The kind that trembles a little when it speaks. The kind that feels like a secret you forgot to keep. The kind that makes you stop scrolling, lean in, and say, "Wait, that's me." Joe got the role. He was going to play Charlie Spring, a gentle, anxious, openly gay teenager navigating his first real crush at an all-boys school. And if you've seen Heartstopper, you already know. This wasn't just another teen drama. It was a quiet revolution. Now I want you to think back to the first time you saw yourself in a character. Like, really truly saw yourself. Not just a stereotype or a sidekick or a punchline. I want you to remember how that felt. Because for millions of queer teens around the world, Joe Locke was that moment. And no one was more aware of the responsibility than Joe himself. He wasn't just playing Charlie. He had been Charlie. He knew what it was like to sit in a classroom and wonder if anyone else felt the same way. He knew the stomach drop of a glance held too long, the fear of being found out, the craving to be understood. So when the cameras rolled, he didn't perform. He remembered, and something magical happened. Heartstopper didn't rely on trauma. It didn't sensationalize queerness. It didn't kill off its gaze for shock value. It offered something radical, joy, tenderness, a first love that felt safe. And Joe made it sing. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the flashiest, but his vulnerability was electric. Every hesitation, every soft smile, every moment of self-doubt, it landed, because it was honest. Now imagine this. You go from being a total unknown to having millions of people DM you, tag you, meme you, cry over you. Overnight. That's what happened when Heartstopper dropped in 2022. The fandom exploded. Tumblr was back. TikTok edits flooded in. Fan art, love letters, tattoos. And through it all, Joe stayed Joe. He was grateful, overwhelmed, and maybe a little stunned. He hadn't trained for fame. He had trained for truth. And yet, here he was. On red carpets, in interviews, on stage at Pride events with Alice Oseman and Kit Connor, waving to crowds of people who finally felt seen. But fame is a funny thing, isn't it? It doesn't care how ready you are. It just shows up, loud and fast. And when you're young, queer, and still figuring yourself out, it can get complicated. Joe suddenly found himself in a strange new space. Praised for being brave, pushed to speak, expected to represent, and he handled it with grace. Not perfection. Not polished PR answers, but grace. In interviews, he spoke openly about how playing Charlie healed something in him. That, for the first time, he felt like he didn't have to split himself into parts. That maybe, just maybe, softness was power. He wasn't trying to be a role model, but let's be honest, he became one anyway. Because when you stand in your truth, especially in front of the whole world, people notice. People follow. People hope. I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever seen someone live so honestly that it made you braver? Has someone else's truth ever unlocked your own? For thousands of queer kids, Joe Locke was that key. But here's what made it even more special. Joe didn't come out because of fame. He had already been out. Before the lights, before the scripts, before the headlines. He wasn't building a brand. He was building a mirror. And every time he spoke, he widened it just a little more, so others could see themselves too. As Heartstopper took over the internet, Joe didn't get louder. He got deeper. He talked about mental health, about growing up gay in a conservative place, about body image, gender expression, and why queer stories deserve softness. And you could tell it wasn't strategy, it was survival. Because for every fan that said thank you, there were trolls who said tone it down. For every message of love, there was a thread of hate. But Joe, he kept showing up. He once said, "There's no such thing as being too much of yourself." And that line stuck with me. maybe it stuck with you too. Because in a world constantly asking queer people to shrink, Joe Locke expanded, with kindness, with vulnerability, and with the kind of strength that doesn't come from shouting, but from choosing not to hide. Here's the thing about getting what you always dreamed of. It rarely comes the way you imagined. Joe Locke had landed the role. He'd made people feel something. He became the face of one of the most loved queer love stories in modern streaming history. And now, the world knew his name. But what happens after the applause? When the confetti settles and the comment sections fill with strangers who think they know you, what do you do then? Because fame doesn't come with a manual. Especially not queer fame, especially not when you're 19, especially not when your entire identity suddenly feels like public property. Joe was still just trying to be Joe. He wanted to go for walks, scroll through memes, eat whatever without someone commenting on his body, his outfit, his posture. But now, everything he did was under a lens. Every pause in an interview was overanalyzed. Every red carpet photo was dissected. Every friendship was speculated into a romance. And every sentence he spoke about being gay was either celebrated or torn apart. You feel that? That pressure in your chest just hearing it? Yeah, imagine living it. Joe handled it better than most, but he wasn't immune. He wasn't a brand. He was a boy becoming a man. On camera, in real time, while the whole internet watched. There were days it weighed on him. He once shared how exhausting it was to constantly be expected to educate, inspire, and smile, all at once. But here's what set Joe apart. He didn't run from the weight. He learned to carry it, on his own terms. And somewhere between the viral tweets and the magazine covers, something shifted. Joe began to speak, not just as Charlie Spring, but as himself. His voice got clearer, sharper. Still kind, but more rooted. He started saying things like, "There's no one way to be queer. We need stories that don't end in tragedy. I want people to feel less alone because I know what that feels like." And you know what? People listened, not because he shouted, but because when he spoke, it mattered. He started opening up more about his own struggles, not in a way that begged for sympathy, but in a way that made space for others. He talked about body image, how hard it was growing up gay and feeling like your body never looked right. He talked about masculinity, how queerness is constantly judged against how manly you seem, as if softness is some sort of failure. He even talked about therapy, about learning to take care of his mind as much as his career. And let me just say, if you're a young queer kid hearing that from someone who looks like you, sounds like you, feels like you, that's not just representation, that's relief. But Joe wasn't trying to be perfect. In fact, he was kind of over that idea entirely. In one interview, he laughed and said, "I have bad days, I get stuff wrong, I'm not always articulate, I'm learning as I go." That honesty? It hit different. Because in a world full of PR polish, here was a rising star saying, "I'm still figuring it out, and that's okay." I want to pause and ask you something here. When was the last time you gave yourself permission to be unfinished? To be messy and human and in progress? Because Joe did that publicly, and in doing so, he gave us permission too. But don't get it twisted. He wasn't just surviving fame, he was reshaping it. Instead of letting others define his voice, Joe began defining it himself. He curated less. He expressed more. He started sharing art that moved him, queer poetry, books, music. He posted photos that weren't perfectly filtered, but real. He showed up at Pride events not just to wave, but to march. He even began writing scripts, essays, speeches, anything that gave him more control over his own narrative. And slowly, Joe stopped being seen as just the guy from Heartstopper. He became something bigger. He became a voice. Not the loudest, not the most experienced, but one that rang true. And for so many of us, especially young queer people, it was the kind of voice we needed. The kind that says, you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You just have to be honest. And that's brave. Because let's be real, it's easier to play a character than to be yourself. It's safer to hide behind scripts, likes, trends, but Joe didn't hide. Even when it was hard, even when it was awkward, even when it felt like too much. And that's why people follow him. Not just fans, but believers. Because at some point, Joe Locke stopped being a breakout actor. He became a quiet kind of leader. The kind who doesn't stand on a stage screaming but sits beside you and says, "Me too." There's this funny thing that happens when your breakout role is too good. People forget it's just a role. For a long time, whenever Joe Locke walked into a room, or popped up in an interview, or posted on Instagram, people didn't say, "Hey, it's Joe." They said Charlie. And sure, Charlie Spring is iconic. He's tender, brave in a quiet way, a little anxious, a little wide-eyed. He's the kind of queer character so many of us wished we had growing up. But here's the truth Joe had to face. He wasn't just playing Charlie, he became Charlie in the eyes of the world. And that's a lot to carry. Especially when you're trying to figure out who you are. When every move you make is being measured against a fictional version of you that people have already fallen in love with. Imagine that. Imagine trying to be your real self, while everyone clings to the version of you that made them feel safe. At first, Joe tried to honor that. He kept things soft, careful. He stayed close to the Charlie Spring image, polite, gracious, emotionally available. But after a while, he started to itch under the costume. Not because he didn't love Charlie, he did, but because Joe was more curious, more complex, more bold than anyone expected. And when he felt that shift inside him, that push to grow beyond the box, he didn't resist it. He leaned in. That's when we started to see something different. He cut his hair. He started experimenting with fashion, sleek suits, bold textures, colors that said "watch me" instead of "don't notice me." He showed up to interviews with a little more edge, a little more fire, and most importantly, he started choosing roles that had nothing to do with Charlie Spring. One of the first major moves was Marvel's Agatha, Coven of Chaos. It was unexpected. A queer teen actor from a Netflix drama, suddenly in the MCU? Yes. And it made perfect sense. Because Joe wasn't chasing comfort, he was chasing stretch. He wanted to play darker, stranger, more layered characters. He wanted to test his own limits, not just as an actor, but as a human being. And honestly, isn't that what growth is supposed to look like? But here's what I loved most about that period. Even as Joe tried on new artistic skins, he never abandoned his core. He didn't become cynical. He didn't distance himself from his past. He just kept evolving, honestly, unapologetically, and a little messily, which, let's be real, is the best kind of evolving. And if you look closely at his interviews during that time, you'll notice something else. The confidence in his voice. Gone were the moments of nervous glancing to the side. Gone were the careful, media-trained sentences. He started saying things like, "We need to let queer people play everything, not just our own trauma." Being visibly gay in this industry shouldn't feel radical, but it still does. I want to surprise people, especially the ones who think they already know me. And that was Joe reclaiming his narrative. He wasn't just a breakout star anymore. He was building a career. He was building art. And fans, we started to notice. We saw the shift, from sweet to sharp, from soft to layered. He didn't lose his kindness, he just stopped keeping it behind glass. It's the kind of transformation you don't see often in young actors, because too many get stuck. They either play it safe, or they burn out trying to prove they're something else. But Joe, he navigated that middle space with grace. He honored where he came from, but he didn't let it define where he was going. I want to pause here and talk to you. Have you ever felt trapped by how others see you? Like no matter how much you grow, they still treat you like a past version of yourself? It's frustrating, isn't it? But maybe the answer isn't to scream, "I've changed." Maybe it's to keep changing anyway. Let the people catch up. That's what Joe did. He kept showing us who he was becoming, not with grand announcements, but with small, intentional choices. The roles he took, the projects he supported, the people he lifted up. He began championing queer artists, young creators, stories that didn't fit the mold. He posted about queer authors, musicians, playwrights. He used his platform not just to shine, but to reflect. And somewhere along the way, something amazing happened. Joe Locke stopped being a character we adored and started becoming a creator in his own right. Not just of roles, but of space. Space for other kids from small islands. Space for other young actors who don't look or love the Hollywood way. Space for softness that bites back, for kindness that knows its worth. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. He just kept showing up, real, changing, and unapologetically himself. Once Joe Locke stepped out of Charlie Spring's shadow, he didn't just reinvent himself as an actor. He made a choice, a conscious, bold, and deeply personal one, to become a protector of space. Not space for ego, not for branding, but for queer kids. Kids like him. And he didn't announce it. He didn't post a mission statement or launch a headline-grabbing foundation. He just started doing the work, quietly, repeatedly, intentionally. One of his earliest and boldest moves? Writing an op-ed for The Independent that called out the British government's failure to provide inclusive sex education. Now pause for a second. How many 19-year-old actors use their first big platform not to pose on red carpets or sell merch, but to take on the education system? Joe didn't just say we need better education. He detailed how LGBTQ+ youth are erased, neglected, and often left to learn about themselves through shame, silence, or worse, trauma. He wrote, "Queer young people are being failed by a system that treats our existence as an optional footnote." That line didn't come from a PR team. It came from a kid who remembered what it felt like to sit in a classroom and never see himself in a textbook. And that op-ed? It caught fire. Teachers discussed it in faculty rooms. Students shared it in group chats. Queer teens printed it out, underlined sentences, handed it to adults, and said, "This. Please read this." But Joe didn't stop at words. He started showing up to panels, roundtables, school initiatives, not to speak at queer youth, but with them. In one school visit, a student asked him, "Do you ever wish you weren't so visible?" Joe took a long pause, then said, "Some days, yes, but if my being visible makes even one of you feel safer, then that's a day I don't regret." It wasn't a performance. It was a promise. He became that kind of presence, the kind that reminds you the room is okay to be in, that you're not asking for too much just by existing. And outside the classrooms and interviews, Joe's Instagram quietly turned into a lighthouse. He reposted queer art, shared mental health resources for trans youth in crisis, tagged queer writers and young creatives with under 1,000 followers. He used swipe-up links not for product drops, but for donation pages and emergency support lines. No hashtags, no brand deals, just help in real time. One of the most powerful things he ever did, amplify voices under attack, without making it about himself. When anti-LGBTQ+ bills were rising in the United Kingdom and United States, Joe didn't just tweet, "Love is love." He called out politicians. He shared verified legal links to resources. He posted protest guides. He used his stories to explain the issues, clearly, factually, without theatrics. And when people pushed back, when trolls flooded his feed or told him to stay in his lane, Joe didn't fight back with insults. He didn't try to sound smarter than them. He just stayed kind, but firm. Always firm. In one comment reply, he wrote, "Being queer is my lane, and protecting our future is not political, it's human." That reply alone was reshared thousands of times. Not because it was flashy, because it was true. But his most impactful act, it wasn't in an article or a comment. It was in how he showed up, again and again, for people who didn't even know him. A fan once wrote, "I never heard the word gay spoken with love until I saw you say it on TV." And Joe wrote back, "Then from now on, I hope you never hear it with anything but love." That's Joe. He doesn't just stand for something, he bends down beside it. He reaches the quiet-hearted teen in the Isle of Man, just like he once was, who thinks they're broken. He reaches the kid in rural Kansas who's too afraid to look at themselves in the mirror. He speaks gently but clearly into the lives of people who didn't even know they needed to be spoken to. And this is where you see the real power of representation. Because it's not just about who's on the screen, it's about what they do once they're seen. Joe Locke chose not to just be seen, he chose to see back. And I want to ask you something. When was the last time someone made you feel that way? Truly seen, not judged, not questioned, just understood. Because that's the space Joe creates. Not with slogans, not with speeches, but with consistent, unshakable presence. A presence that says, you don't have to be loud to make a difference. You don't have to be perfect to belong here. You're already enough. And when he says it, he means it. Because once, not that long ago, he needed to hear it too. Some stories reach a peak and fade. Others keep unfolding, quietly changing lives even after the lights dim. Joe Locke's story is the second kind. He could have stayed in his lane, played it safe, let Charlie Spring define him forever. But instead, he asked a different question. What more can I do with this platform, this voice, this moment? And in answering that, Joe stopped being a breakout actor. He became a builder of safer spaces, of honest stories, of conversations that don't always trend but desperately need to happen. And he's not waiting until he's older or more experienced. He's doing it now. One interview at a time, one vulnerable post at a time, one queer teen he never meets but still reaches at a time. You've probably seen it too, even if you didn't name it. The way Joe answers questions that most celebrities dodge. The way he names what hurts but also imagines what could heal. The way he amplifies joy, not as a distraction from pain, but as a form of resistance. He's not trying to be a hero. He's just choosing to be useful. And that choice? That's revolutionary. Because queer youth today don't just need representation, they need direction. They don't just want to see themselves, they want to know what comes next. And Joe, without pretending to have all the answers, still gives them a kind of map. He shows what it looks like to stand up without shouting, advocate without ego, grow publicly without shame. Even in the way he talks about love, there's no cynicism. He doesn't treat vulnerability like a weakness. He treats it like a strength. He's told fans, it's okay if you're still figuring it out. I still am too. That line right there, it lands deeper than any speech. Because when you're young and queer and the world feels impossible, sometimes the most powerful thing someone can say to you is, you don't have to be done yet. And Joe doesn't pretend to be done. He's still curious, still learning, still stretching towards something bigger than himself. He's just doing it out loud. So the rest of us don't feel like we're doing it alone. And that matters. God, it matters. Because the world is still scary sometimes. Queer kids are still being silenced, still being targeted, still being told that softness is a sin and pride is provocation. But Joe's existence, his visible, joyful, complex, evolving existence, is the counter-argument to all of that. He says, no, we belong, not in the margins, not in the shadows. We belong in the center, in full color, with our stories intact. And I want to ask you something right now. Yes, you watching this. What would it feel like to live your life that way? Unfiltered, unapologetic, not perfect, but present. What would it feel like to stop shrinking, to stop waiting, to stop asking for permission just to be who you are? Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're still hiding or healing or holding your breath. That's okay, because people like Joe Locke, they're not here to demand you bloom on command. They're here to remind you, there's nothing wrong with growing slow. He's not the loudest, he's not the most polished, but he's honest. And in this world, that's rare and holy. So wherever Joe goes from here, whether it's a lead role in a Broadway revival, a deeply weird indie film, or writing the next great queer novel, know this, he's already done something most people never do. He's changed the story, not just his, ours. And as his journey keeps unfolding, the question isn't just what will Joe Locke do next? It's what will you? Will you write? Will you speak up? Will you finally press post on that message you've been scared to share? Will you let yourself be seen, not just in the light that flatters, but in the truth that frees? Because here's the quiet miracle of Joe's story. He doesn't stand on a stage saying, look at me. He says, look at you, you're already enough. And now, you can begin. So maybe this isn't the end of a story at all. Maybe it's the beginning of yours. Because let's be honest, some of us never had a Joe growing up. We didn't see ourselves on screen. We didn't hear our stories in classrooms. No one looked us in the eye and said, you matter, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. But that's the beauty of now, of this moment, of someone like Joe Locke standing in the light and choosing to reflect it outward. He reminds us that visibility isn't the finish line. It's the invitation. And if you're here watching this, feeling something stir inside, maybe a little ache, maybe a spark, that's not by accident. That's the part of you that still wants more. More joy, more truth, more space. And you know what? You deserve it. Not when you're braver, not when you're thinner, louder, clearer, queerer, but now. Exactly as you are. Because the most radical thing you can do in a world that teaches you to hide is to show up anyway. And if Joe Locke could do it, a shy kid from a tiny island with no blueprint, no spotlight, just a beating heart and a love for the stage, then maybe you can too. Not for applause, not for followers, but for the freedom of finally living in your own skin. So as the credits roll on this chapter, don't let it be an ending. Let it be a beginning. Not of Joe's story, of yours. So if this story moved something in you, if it made you feel seen, or soft, or just a little more possible, don't let it stop here. Pass it on. Share this video with someone who's still figuring themselves out. Leave a comment if you've ever felt like Joe, quiet, different, maybe even invisible. Or just tell us, what would your story look like if you let it begin today? Because that's what stories like this are meant to do. Not just sit on a screen, but spark something real. Here, we believe queer stories aren't side plots. They're the heart of something bigger, something human, something healing. So if that's a journey you want to keep taking, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one. Because your voice, it belongs here too. See you next time.